This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, investigative journalist Karen Hao discusses OpenAI under the leadership of Sam Altman and her book, Empire of AI. Karen Hao has been covering the emergence of AI since 2019, and in her deeply researched book, she compares the fast-growing AI sector to a modern-day colonial world order. She is interviewed by Natasha Tiku, tech and culture reporter for The Washington Post.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Natasha Tiku, tech culture reporter for The Washington Post. Tonight, I'll be talking with Karen Hao, author of the new book, Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI. Just a few reminders before we get started. The program is being recorded, so if you could turn off your cell phones for the duration. And if you have any questions for Karen, you can write them on the paper that was on your seat, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can ask them in the YouTube chat. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Karen. Karen Hao is an award-winning journalist covering the impacts of artificial intelligence on society. She writes for publications including The Atlantic, leads the Pulitzer Center's AI Spotlight series, a program training thousands of journalists around the world on how to cover AI. She was formerly a reporter for The Wall Street Journal covering American and Chinese tech companies and a senior editor for AI at the MIT Technology Review. Karen, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, as you know, I absolutely adored this book. I have to say, I think I have maybe, in the running for reading most articles about OpenAI ever, and I was still absolutely riveted. I didn't want to put it down. I had to make my kid dinner. I had to do some chores, but I tore through it. So the first question I wanted to ask is, I saw you mention on X that you use The Crown as your inspiration for how to structure the book. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the title of the book, Empire of AI, it's a reference to this argument that I make in the book that these companies like OpenAI are new forms of empire. And the reason I make this argument is because empires of old and empires of AI, as I call them, check off all of the same features of empire building. The first one is that they lay claim to resources that are not their own, but they design the rules such that it seems like it was always their own. So that refers to, the data that they scrape on the internet where they say, it was there for free and it's totally fair for us to take it. But obviously, people who originally put that data on the internet did not have informed consent when they put it on there for understanding that it would inevitably be trained for training these AI models. Empires also exploit a lot of labor. So that means they either didn't pay that labor back in the day, or they pay them abysmally and put them in extreme working conditions. And AI companies do that. They contract workers all around the world, particularly in the global south, and they put them in these structurally really intense jobs that can lead them to either be harmed because of the way that the job is precarious or because of the actual substance of the job. And they also monopolize knowledge production. So one of the things that has happened in the last 10 years with the AI industry is these companies have become so powerful and have so much money to compensate AI researchers that we've seen most AI researchers in the world today shift from academia to these companies. And so most AI research today is actually being produced and filtered through the lens of what is good for these companies versus suppressing research that is bad for these companies. And the public understanding of AI and its limitations, how it works, is now all filtered through the empire. And the last feature is that they really create this narrative that there are good empires in the world and there are bad empires in the world. And the reason why they, the good empire, need to be an empire in the first place and do all this resource extraction, labor exploitation, is because they need to be strong to beat back the evil empire. And in my book, I write about how OpenAI sort of changes who is the evil empire over time, but depending on what is the most useful enemy to have at that time. But as the good empire, they then conceive of themselves as having some kind of civilizing mission. They're ultimately doing all of this work to bring modernity and progress to the rest of humanity. And so I started thinking a lot about, there were kind of multiple challenges to structuring the book, because I made a promise to myself when I started working on it that I did not want to write a corporate book that stayed within Silicon Valley. I did not think that that would be in service of the reader and ultimately understanding how expansive this technology is and how it can have such wide-reaching impacts on all corners of the world. But to write a book where you are constantly shifting perspective and constantly shifting characters can be really confusing for a reader. They have to remember a lot of names and a whole cast and all of these different countries, contexts, and their histories and things like that. And eventually I thought, well, wait a minute, The Crown does this too. Like, ultimately, The Crown it's about a global system of power, and it's profiling the people in this system. And sometimes they're at the center of power, sometimes they're at the edges of power, and you see through the eyes of these different characters ultimately the same thing, which is the profile of this empire and the impact that it has around the world. And so I ended up structuring the book in part thinking about that, like how did The Crown successfully make all of these characters feel cohesive, and ultimately it be not just about the character, but the characters are conduits for understanding this global empire that is in front of us.
And you traveled a tremendous amount for this book and for your previous work. I was hoping you could talk just a little bit more about why it was important to be on the ground in those areas. Like, what did you learn that you couldn't have done over a call or over Zoom? And, in particular, I guess I'm thinking about the Google Urban Park. The book is full of really rich details like that. But I don't know if that's the one that stands out to you, but I imagine you talked to some of these people initially. And then when you're going there, like, what was the difference?
Yeah, so the book ultimately takes people to Kenya, to Chile, to Uruguay, to Colombia, and it touches a little bit on previous reporting that I had done in South Africa. And I just realized early, not during the book reporting process, but early in my own journalism career, that there's so many things that you learn when you're on the ground that you can't really ascertain over the phone. Understanding how people live, it's really hard to phrase questions, to ask people, what is your socioeconomic status? Because people's relationship to their socioeconomic status is totally relative to what they know. And so you can't fully describe, people don't have the awareness of what would an American want to know about my life. They're thinking in their own terms. And so one of the things that really struck me when I went to Kenya was understanding, like I ended up going to Kenya to meet workers that had either been contracted by OpenAI to do content moderation for their products, or other workers that had done data annotation and were contracted by Scale AI to be in service of other types of AI companies. And one thing that really struck me was going to each neighborhood. Like I was with a driver that drove me all around Nairobi, which is this huge, sprawling city, and it takes hours to get from one side to the other. And the neighborhoods dramatically change. Like, some of them are really, really wealthy, and there's like 5-star hotels and trendy cafes and this kind of international scene. And then you get to the far reaches and the buildings start turning from these skyscrapers into squat buildings, into tin buildings, and you can't really get that texture without actually driving through these spaces. And I noticed that every single worker that I met, we were going to the furthest reaches, like the slums of Nairobi, to where the roads would get really, really narrow, and our car barely fit on these dirt paths. And for workers that were working for OpenAI, they were contracted by a middleman firm called Sama that ultimately is structured more like a job where you have shifts. You go into an office. During the pandemic, they were not going to the office. They were working at home, but they would work these shifts from like 3 a.m. to noon, and then from noon to midnight or some kind of crazy hours. And they were slightly better off than the scale AI workers who were ultimately not working for a company with shifts. They were ultimately tasking and like doing gig work. And so the shift from, a upper lower class house to a lower class house was still quite dramatic. And that was something that I would have never been able to understand through the phone. And then the other anecdote that you mentioned was I was in Chile embedding with water activists, because one of the things that has happened in Chile in the last few years is, as there's been a explosive hunger for more data centers and more supercomputers, these U.S. companies have run out of land and power in developed countries, so they're expanding very dramatically into developing countries. And Chile has, like several other countries, the government at least has been very welcoming of this, because they see it as foreign direct investment, as a great economic opportunity to the country. But then the data centers land in communities that they do not see it in the same way. And there was this Google data center that ended up in the Greater Santiago metropolitan region. And it's specifically, like, Chile has a history of living under dictatorship. And during that dictatorship, basically everything that was a public good was privatized, including water. So water is a private service in Chile, except for one specific neighborhood where, by some anomaly, they retained a public water source, and that is the water that they use within that community. And then during emergency situations in Chile, that water is also wheeled out for servicing other communities. And that is exactly the community that Google chose to build a data center in, and to use freshwater resources for their data center. At least that was in their proposal. And one of the things that Google did when they built their first data center, when no one was paying attention, was they gave the community a urban park. They were like, we're going to plant some trees to thank you for hosting this data center. And I went to visit the park, and the trees were the scrawniest, saddest trees I have ever seen. And there was this giant sign in the middle of the park explaining this project. And it literally, I write about this in the book, had a diagram where it had, like, on one side, industrial development and like soot like billowing out of these factories, because the place that they had chosen was a place that had become a sacrifice zone. A lot of industry went there. There was a lot of air pollution, and it said smog. And then there was rain coming out of the cloud labeled smog to water the trees. And I was like, this is a symbiotic relationship. And you can't get those details without seeing it for your own eyes. And while I was looking at this sign and being like, what in the F is this? This city council member who had taken me here, who's the city council member of that city, who explicitly was like, you have to see this park, was like, saw my reaction, and she was like, do you feel like you're in Silicon Valley now? And so, yeah, there were just so many moments like that texture that you just cannot get. And just like the human to human interaction with these people as well. And those like really charming moments where they themselves, like the only thing they can do is laugh about this. You also can't get over a phone.
Yeah. And I feel like it helped tease out these commonalities between their stories, even when they're doing different work, like the water activists and the contractors who are moderating. They're all trying to discern like this opaque system that, will cut them out at a moment's notice. Yeah. So you paired those stories with some really new and exciting insider details about OpenAI. Could you talk to me about like why did people, if there was kind of common themes, like why did people want to talk to you for this book?
There were a lot of different reasons why people wanted to talk to me. So one of the reasons was back in the day, I was the first journalist to ever profile OpenAI. I embedded within the company for 3 days in August 2019. At the time, I was a reporter at MIT Technology Review, so OpenAI was on my radar because we were covering the most cutting-edge emerging research that didn't yet have commercial potential, and that's how OpenAI fashioned themselves at the time. They were a fundamental AI research lab. They weren't doing anything commercially related, and in 2018, 2019, there was a series of changes that were happening within the organization, one of which was that they originally said they were going to open source all their research, and then they started withholding some research. And another one being that they restructured into a nonprofit with a for-profit nested inside. I'm sure many of you are well familiar with this now interesting corporate structure. But it kind of occurred to me that these changes, they obviously signaled a shift at OpenAI, but because OpenAI was gaining a lot of prominence in both the AI world and also in the policy world, and the way that they were shaping the public narrative around AI, that these shifts could potentially be consequential for the way that AI ultimately was introduced to the public and to society. So I ended up proposing to write about the company to my editor, and then my editor was like, why don't you actually just do a profile? And I showed up. The profile was not something that OpenAI was very happy with, as in they really hated it. And they decided not to speak to me for the next 3 years. And when I started working on the book, I thought that this meant that no one would speak to me, because I thought that the employees themselves also hated me. And one of the reasons that people actually talked to me was, oh my God, I loved your profile. I thought it was actually a really accurate representation of the company. Another common reason was they needed therapy. And because I know the cast of characters so well, I know the company dynamics, and I am sworn to secrecy if, they want to speak to me anonymously, it's really cathartic for them. And multiple sources were like, wow, this was great. Like, let me call you again next week. I think another one was just that people really felt pretty universally that they had seen and witnessed something that was historic, whether good or bad, and they wanted it documented. They wanted someone to be able to witness the full course of what had happened within the company, because some of them thinking that it was incredible and they really wanted that documented, and some thinking like uneasy with their participation in an organization that they ultimately came to view critically, and so they wanted that documented as well. So that was probably like the top 3 reasons, but there was also a whole host of others.
Yeah. And I also, kind of going back to the individuals that you profiled, like across the globe, I've heard you talk about it as horizontal harms, as opposed to the vertical ones that we tend here in San Francisco tend to focus on. And I was hoping you could just, kind of sketch out the differences there and why you think it's important to look at the harms that you did.
Yeah, so I think in the course of reporting on my book, the thing that I started solidifying in my mind was, originally I was thinking, I want to show the full AI supply chain and make it feel real, because most people in the public, they don't think of digital technologies as even having a physical supply chain or having people involved in it. And I just wanted to illustrate that and show how each stage of this supply chain, the data labeling, the training, all has externalities attached to it that aren't being thought about right now. Like there are huge environmental externalities, there's the labor exploitation externalities, but I was thinking about it as like, let me just think about it vertically, like each stage has its own contained thing. As I continued to report and as I traveled and as I started realizing that, the things that the Kenyan workers were saying to me were almost identical to the things that the Chilean water activists were saying to me, what they were ultimately saying was, there's this global system of power, this empire. Like I never had to convince them that there was an empire. You know, like they used that language before I used that language. Like the Chilean water activists were like, Chile has like a very, very long history of extraction and colonialism. Like this is just the same thing over and over and over again. Like our ancestors dealt with this. This is our generation's fight, and it's a continuum. But the thing that I realized that the horizontal harm that they were all experiencing was this severe loss of agency and the ability to shape their future. And that made me understand more profoundly that if we allow more and more people to feel this way, if we allow the empire to continue doing what it does, which is to like having people at the top dictate essentially how this technology should be, how it should be developed, how it should impact people, how it should be integrated into everything, more and more people are going to feel that loss of agency. And once you have the majority of people in the world feeling like they don't have control over their future, then democracy can't survive. Because you cannot, like, democracy literally depends on people feeling the agency to self-determine their collective future. And that's when I understood that there's a much more horizontal harm that is happening here. I wrote this before the current political situation in the US, but I mean, like, I think people in the US now finally also feel the same kind of extraordinary loss of agency. Like I talk to a lot of people in the US in different communities that are wrestling with, I don't know how to survive in the future. Like I don't know whether I have a place in that future anymore because of varying reasons, including AI, including like the loss of economic opportunity, including feeling like their vote doesn't matter anymore. You know, like these are things that ultimately make it such that we return back to an age of empire away from democracy.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
And in the book, you really contrast that with the agency that these AI executives have. Like you make this argument that this was not inevitable. This is the consequence, like the paradigm, the way we build AI now, most particularly large language models, the technology that powers ChatGPT. Can you talk about some of those like really influential decisions that kind of set up this dynamic that we're in right now?
I think the biggest, most consequential decision that OpenAI made very early on in its history was deciding to scale these large language models by orders of magnitude. They had a step change, like a huge leap in the scale of these systems from GPT-2 to GPT-3. And this was based on a confluence of opinions, essentially, by the different executives and their positionalities on the matter. So at the time, there was Ilya Sutskever, who was the chief scientist. And Ilya Sutskever is very much a deep learning diehard believer. He thinks that ultimately the human brain is perfectly computable, like human intelligence is perfectly computable, and that if you have enough data and enough compute in the world, you will inevitably be able to recreate human intelligence, but you need to get to that scale. So he would always talk about, you know, like the neural networks that were being trained at the time, they only had whatever, a few thousand nodes or something like that, even a few million nodes, whereas brains had like trillions. And so he was really on this quest to like, how do we get to brain scale neural networks? Because then we will recreate human intelligence. So he was aggressively on that scaling quest. Altman, he comes from a very Silicon Valley background where it's always about adding zeros. And so he was on that scaling quest of, absolutely, let's go big or go home. Like we need to build the biggest supercomputers out there. We need to pump the largest amount of data in there. And then Dario Amodei, who's now the CEO of Anthropic, but was the director of research at OpenAI at the time, he really wanted to scale things aggressively because he had hit upon two things. One was what we now know as scaling laws, which is this idea that if you continue to pump more data and more compute into these systems, that there's actually somewhat of a predictable gain in performance those scaling laws are now starting to fall apart. But at the time, they thought, oh, this is like he wanted to see how far it could go as like a scientist, as curious about how far it could go. And also, he specifically wanted to have a lead over anyone else in the world to scale this model aggressively so that they could then use the lead time to perform research and ultimately AI safety research, and his conception of what AI safety means, which is ultimately trying to prevent rogue AI from going rogue and destroying humanity. And so all of them were oriented for different reasons towards this idea of like, we need to just blow this thing up to as big as we can get. And because Altman is uniquely talented at raising capital, at building partnerships, he was then able to get Microsoft to build a 10,000 chip supercomputer. And so they went, we will use all 10,000 chips to train GPT-3. And before that, GPT-2 had only been trained on, I think, a couple hundred chips. So this was like two orders of magnitude jump. And that step change from GPT-2 to GPT-3 was then the thing that kind of launched every other company down this trajectory of scaling at all costs, and led to this, what essentially we see now, which is this empire building type conquest of needing all of the resources, all of the data, all of the everything in the world to try and sustain that trajectory.
So you touched on this a little bit with the rogue AI, but the book really goes into how these two camps of AI thinking, which have come to at least dominate public debate because those camps have very influential executives, but you have the doomers and the boomers inside OpenAI, inside this company. Can you sketch out like the arguments from each camp?
Yeah, so in the public, I mean, the way that discourse has become polarized, it's like AI will bring us to utopia or AI will kill all of humanity. And of course, that stems from the ideologies that have sort of cultivated within Silicon Valley and that then end up being diluted and echoed across like the public in ways where people don't ultimately understand where the root is from anymore. But what I write about in one of the chapters is that what I call the AGI religion, there is a quasi-religious belief, and researchers who work on these models, they call it a belief too. There's a belief that ultimately we will be able to fully recreate human intelligence, and that is going to have civilizational transformation. And, like Sutskever himself has just said, like, you have to believe, like, there's not really evidence, like there's some evidence that there has been dramatic progress in recent years, but does that evidence substantiate that there is an ability to ultimately recreate human intelligence? No. It is just something that you innately feel. And there are two sects of this religion, the boomers and the doomers, as I describe them. One is the AGI will bring us to utopia, and the other one is the AGI will kill all of humanity. And the thing that I was most surprised by in reporting the book was I originally thought that this was rhetoric. I thought that it was just, the executives saying this for the purpose of controlling the technology more, like justifying that they continue to control the technology. Like if you paint, regardless of whether you say it's going to bring utopia or dystopia, it paints the technology as supremely powerful and therefore something that needs to be very carefully controlled by a small handful of people rather than be more democratized in the hands of many people. But the thing that struck me was that there are people who genuinely, sincerely believe this, and it truly is their quasi-religious, the thing that they innately pray to, and like I would talk to people who in the doomer camp who their voices quiver when they talk to me about the idea that AI could destroy all of humanity. This is a very visceral reaction. They actually are scared of this possibility, and they're scared that their actions could lead to that possibility if they do not very, very carefully control their actions. And I spoke to people who were so shocked and wide-eyed with wonder, talking about the profound, positive, utopic things that could stem from this. And ultimately, both of these sects ended up in OpenAI and have been within OpenAI throughout the company's history because early on when they were conceptualized, very few people believed in the AGI religion. So the people who did naturally kind of self-chose, self-elected to be within this organization, but were of one of two orientations. And so a lot of OpenAI's history has been one of chaos and drama. Of course, like the most public version of that chaos and drama was Sam Altman being fired by the board and then being reinstated. But before that, there was also plenty of drama. It just wasn't a very prominent company yet, so most people weren't really paying attention. But a lot of it was this clash, this ideological clash of should we be accelerating this technology because we want to release it into the world as quickly as possible because that will bring us to utopia as quickly as possible, or should we be building this technology as quickly as possible to then hoard it so that we can do research on it because otherwise it could destroy everything. And ultimately what I concluded from a lot of my reporting and what I write in the book is the boomers and the doomers, they co-own the responsibility for the rapid acceleration of AI development in the last few years because they were both oriented around this belief.
Now it's been 3 years, right, since like the launch of ChatGPT. Have you seen the doomers approach development of AI any differently than the boomers?
I think there is now more factions within the doomer community where there are people who still orient themselves around let's accelerate this as quickly as possible so that we can do research on it and have that lead. And now there's like new blossoming movements that are like, we actually should just stop the whole thing. We should just stop it. And it's been an interesting, it's been an interesting splintering of the community, and ultimately it still, interestingly enough, fortifies this idea that AGI is almost here, AGI is possible, AGI is all powerful. So regardless of what they have, what their conclusion has become, the rhetoric is still continuing to reinforce the trajectory that we're currently on.
And in the book, you try to grapple with where does Altman stand? Like, what is his belief? Can you talk a little bit about like how, the conclusion that you ended up coming to?
Yeah. So every time I was interviewing a source who knew Sam Altman, I would always ask them, like, what do you think of him? And like, there are all these rumors swirling around about his personality, and is he someone that you find to be consistently candid, or is he someone that like there are detractors of Altman will say that he's a liar, that he's manipulative. Like, do you agree with that, or what is your experience? And it was really hard to ascertain initially because, of course, it's just a matter of opinion. Like, people can say, oh, no, like, he's super honest. Or people can be like, yeah, he's, like, the greatest liar that I've ever met. And I'd be like, this isn't really getting me anywhere. And so I started asking people, what did Sam say to you in this specific moment in time about this specific thing, about what he believed and also why the company was doing what it was doing? And that's when I realized that he said different things to different people depending on what they believed. And what many people said was over time, like regardless of whether they worked closely with him or not so closely or long time or short time, whatever, pretty much everyone said, I don't actually know what Sam believes. And that was something that was quite striking. Like, even people that had worked with him very closely for a very long time had no real grasp of what he believed. But they were like, but this is what he said to me that he believed in this particular conversation. And because I interviewed enough people through all of the different eras and years and milestones of OpenAI, I was able to have, many people at each era telling me what Sam told them in that moment and realizing that they were all being told different things.
So a lot of the folks like Sam or Dario that you profile in the book, right now their, pronouncements predictions about the future are treated as news by the media, by regulators, by the public. What did you learn in the course of reporting that could help people kind of contextualize, like, how should we take these pronouncements from executives? Like, what are their blind spots? You know, they say AGI is coming 2027. What do you say?
One of the things specifically with OpenAI that I realized was Sam Altman will make he times his pronouncements and the degree to which the grandiosity of his pronouncements is pretty correlated with how much tumult is happening within the organization. So the more internal chaos there is, the more grandiose his pronouncements become, and the more he starts to say how confident he is about OpenAI's future. So it's a pretty good signal if he's saying, I am so excited about what's happening and everything is going to be amazing, that there's something that he's trying to divert attention away from. And I think that is generally a pretty good way to understand a lot of these executives and their pronouncements, is that they, you know, even though, as I mentioned, one of the surprises in reporting the book was that this rhetoric of AGI will bring us to utopia or destroy humanity was not just rhetoric, that there is actually belief around it. At the top level, the executive level, they also do, whether or not they themselves ascribe to the AGI religion, they do also need to step into the role of the executive and use this rhetorically, use it as a way to ward off regulation, to quell public concern or amp up public concern as they need to cut away all of the obstacles that are happening and to get rid of any scrutiny that's happening. And so I think that the leaning in, you know, like, it was a lot. There was a lot more layers to what ultimately makes headlines, and I realized that there is a base layer of people who genuinely believe it, and then there are people who maybe believe it but also like leverage it, and that is ultimately what then trickles up to the headlines. And one of the analogies that I've actually started using, which I don't put in the book, but as I continued reporting the book, I really started to feel like the AI world is a little bit like Dune. In that at some point, you know, in Dune, Paul Atreides' mom makes this myth about Paul in order to control people, to influence people. But then the people who encounter this myth, they don't realize that it's a creation, of course. Like, they think that it's just true. And so they just genuinely deeply believe it, to the point where suddenly Paul starts to believe it too. He forgets that his mom actually created this myth. And he starts to step into and embody this character. And I really did feel like when I was talking with people in this world that, like, no one really remembers how it originally started, but now it's just everyone believes it and it's just gospel now. And it also is very rhetorically useful.
You didn't spend much time in the book talking about the utopia vision, you know, but to sketch it out very broadly, it's like infinite abundance, no
AGI will cure cancer, no poverty,
no material constrictions.
Yeah.
But like, if I'm reading the subtext right, you know, part of the reason why you were focusing on the supply chain and like on how economic benefits are distributed, because that's the other part of the utopia vision, is that no one will have to work and the executives will, you know, distribute universal basic income, something that Sam has done research on. So I read your focus on, you know, how democratic, as in like how much power are you actually distributing? You know, what did your reporting, I guess, tell us about how these executives operate? And like, do you think it's indicative of how they might operate if, you know, if they were, like, let's not even say AGI, but say they were to become multi-trillion-dollar companies and, you know, amass and concentrate even more power? Like,
yeah, like ultimately, like, are they going to then redistribute it?
Yeah. I find that like quite, I don't know why that is not talked about more often, especially their view of labor and of like the worth of different human beings.
Yeah. Yeah, the short answer is no, they're not going to redistribute it. And the evidence for that is, you know, the Kenyan workers, like I met Kenyan workers that were contracted by OpenAI. And as I mentioned earlier, they were contracted due to content moderation effectively. And what specifically the project was, the company at the time, they were starting to move from research to commercialization. So they were thinking about what happens when we put text generation tools that can spew anything into the hands of millions of users. If it's going to start spewing toxic, abusive hate speech, that's not going to be a very compelling product. It's going to create a scandal. In fact, you know, Microsoft's Tay, which is a very infamous chatbot scandal where it did start spewing all this stuff, was evidence of why they needed to not have that happen. And so they contracted these workers to build a content moderation filter that would wrap around the model.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
And in order to build that filter, they gave these workers reams of the worst text on the internet, as well as AI-generated text where OpenAI prompted models to imagine the worst text on the internet. And then these workers had to put that into a very detailed taxonomy. Is this violent content? Is this sexual content? Is it graphic violent content? Is it extremely graphic violent content? Is it sexual abuse content? Is it sexual abuse content that involves children? And obviously, it ended up being really psychologically harmful for these workers, in the same way that content moderation for social media was really psychologically harmful. And I read about a man named Mofat Okinye. I met him when he was 28. And one of the things that he taught me is it's not just something that unravels the individual, it unravels their family and their community, because there are people that depend on that individual that is suddenly not able to function. And so he was in a position where he had a wife. That wife had a daughter from a previous relationship that he loved and called his baby girl. And as he was doing this work, he started withdrawing, and his personality just did a 180. And his wife got really scared because he was unable to say to her, "Oh, I'm doing a job where I read sex content all day." He didn't know how to explain why he was doing that, what that was for. And so one day his wife texts him saying, "I want fish for dinner." So he goes out and buys one for him, one for her, one for the stepdaughter. And when he comes back home, they're gone. They've like packed up their bags, left, and she texts him and says, "I don't know the man that you've become anymore. I'm never coming back." And he was paid around $2 an hour. And he said to me, and many of the workers that I interviewed, they were like, it's not that we don't, like, we want jobs, but we want dignified jobs, and we want to be treated like professionals, and we want to be treated like experts. Like, we have expertise too, but we're asked day in and day out to do this work based on some kind of detailed, extremely detailed, like, dictation of this is exactly what's right, this is exactly what's wrong, no consultation whatsoever. They have no idea. They had no idea that they were even working for OpenAI. They actually discovered it because one of their managers leaked that information to them. And when you look at that and you think, well, wait a minute, this could have been an opportunity to redistribute some of the economic benefits. I mean, these companies are reaping millions, billions of revenue, and they're paying these workers $2 an hour, and they're not treating them as equals in any way. And there's not actually any justification for why those workers are paid so little and then AI researchers are paid so much. It's an ideological justification. It's an ideology that believes in hierarchy, that there are certain people that are superior and their knowledge and expertise is superior, therefore they earn $1 million compensation packages, and there are other people that are inferior, their knowledge is just worthless, their skills are worthless, their humanity is not one that should be fully recognized, and therefore they get to earn $2 an hour. And And that was just like one of many examples that I encountered where there was a clear moment in which there could have been a redistribution of economic opportunity, even in the development of the technology, and it never happened. And instead, you see the logic of empire, the hierarchy. That is the logic of empire, is the idea that there's superior and inferior people in this world. And therefore, the superior people have a God-given right or a nature-given right to rule over the inferior people.
And you talked about how this model of developing AI, it's been adopted across the industry, and it forecloses on other ways of, other visions for the future, other ways of doing things. What are some of the ways that you encountered while reporting the book that you found like hopeful or inspiring?
Yeah, so the thing that struck me the most was people that I interviewed that you would assume have the least amount of agency and voice in the world were the ones who remembered the most that they actually did. And I mean the people like the Kenyan workers, the people like the Chilean water activists who, against all odds, attracted international media attention. The reason I even knew about them was because there had been other reporting done on their stories. And I speak to friends constantly, in developed contexts who are like, well, we have no data privacy anymore, whatever. Like, I'm just going to give all of my data. And that is a lack of agency and a lack of ownership over ultimately a resource that is your own. And these, like the Chilean water activists, they were like, this is our water. Like, you are not taking it unless you give us a really good deal around this water. It's like it wasn't that they were completely opposed to the idea of any data centers, but they were like, you can't just come in and take it without consulting us, and you can't like give us nothing in return. And one of the activists said, and don't even think about giving us one of those Google parks again. Because, it's not even a park, but also, like, you're planting trees that then sap more water. Like, what are you doing? You're going to, like, put in infrastructure that takes water and then give us something that takes more water? Like, that's not logical at all. And so because they recognized that, they were willing to fight tooth and nail to preserve that ownership. So they, like, literally were on the streets every day when they heard about this Google project, handing out flyers, knocking on people's doors, talking to this, like, petitioning city council, and just constantly making a lot of noise and making it really difficult for Google to move forward, to the point where it escalated to Google Chile, and then it escalated to Google Mountain View, and then Google Mountain View was like, oh shoot, we need to send some people to make nice with these people, and then they sent them over, and they only spoke English. And the activists were, they came full show of force. They brought all of the community organizations within that municipality. They were like, we're not going to come alone just as water activists. We're going to come with, I think it was like over a dozen different community organizations, like women's rights organizations, labor rights organizations, and other environmental organizations. We're all going to sit there and stare at these people until they say something that's worth hearing. And as the Google Mountain View people were like speaking in English, they were being translated by a Google lawyer. Mm-hmm. And there were people in these community groups who are bilingual. They understand English. And they were like, wait a minute, this lawyer is not translating things correctly. And so, like, just time and again, like, no matter what obstacle they encountered, they just kept pushing, to the point where eventually it rose to the attention of the Chilean government. And the Chilean government then realized, okay, we need to create a roundtable where we actually have community activists and companies seated at the same table, and government representatives. And anytime we talk about data center development, we actually have to consult the people who are literally going to be hosting it on their land. And that was a huge win for this community. I mean, was it the definitive win? No. They were like, the fight's not over. Like, we have to continue being vigilant. Like, we need to continue making sure we hold these companies and our government accountable, because at any moment, if we blink, like, they could just continue to do what they've always been doing. And that kind of spirit, where they were just constantly willing to put in that effort to defend something that they owned was just, I think, something that all of us can learn from.
So many of the harms, the existing harms that you write about in your book are very summarily dismissed by AI executives, right? Like, the concept of LLMs won't work if we have to pay copyright. AGI will solve climate change and therefore the water crisis, will make our data centers more efficient. What is your hope with the book? Like, do you think that you will be able to change those minds? Is it who is this for?
I don't think I'm ultimately trying to change the minds of the AI executives. I was in Seattle yesterday for a book event, and I had a really wonderful opportunity to talk with Ted Chiang. And he said to me, your job is not to convince the people who already believe something fundamentally different from you. Your job is to talk to the public, to convince them. And those are the people that then apply pressure to these organizations. And they demand what they want to see out of this technology and how it's developed and how it's going to shape society. And I think he's exactly right that, like, ultimately what I hope the book does is help people understand what is happening right now. Like, here's the evidence. So much of the AI discourse is based in theory. Like, there are no humans and real lives and texture around, like, how is AI actually affecting people? And so when you're always talking in the theoretical, it's impossible to figure out, like, who's right, who's wrong, who to listen to, because it's all just projection. And I just wanted to, like, as much as possible, present, like, all of the different stories of people that are encountering this technology all around the world, and just say, this is what's actually happening. So let's use this as data for understanding what happens next. And one of the things that I wrote in a piece a while ago for The Atlantic is it really feels like sometimes the AI discourse is like AI executives talking about a theoretical future that somehow outweighs actual substance. It's climate change is going to be solved, but there's nothing to suggest that. And climate change is literally right now being accelerated because of these technologies. Like, the amount of energy that is used to power these data centers is coming from fossil fuels. Sam Altman literally was just testifying to the Senate a couple weeks ago, and he said himself it's most likely, he hedged, going to come from natural gas, and he picked the nicest of the fossil fuels. But the reality is that there's also coal plants that are being their lives are being extended. There are Grok is currently being trained on a supercomputer built in Memphis, Tennessee, that is running on 36 unlicensed methane gas turbines that are pumping thousands of tons of air pollutants into that community. And so this is what's actually happening, and we cannot use a theoretical possible future to justify all of this happening in the present.
Yeah, I think it provides, like, you talk about how Sam is a once in a generation, like, storyteller, and that's how he's able to raise so much funding. And I feel like you're giving us a different story, a very different story, that you really don't hear much of what you have highlighted in the book discussed on the Senate floor, and in such an evocative way. I'm going to read some questions from the audience. Do you see a way for individuals to use AI ethically and find a realistic way to interact with its ever-increasing presence in a way that's not reckless or irresponsible?
This is really a good question. So one of the things that I say in the book is I'm not, like, anti all AI, because AI refers to so many different types of technologies that it's really, it's such a huge grab bag of technologies. And so the specific thing that I heavily criticize in the book is the Silicon Valley conception of AI, these colossal models, this idea that they're trying to build everything machines, and therefore they need to consume all of these resources in the world to do so. But there are many other AI technologies that are not like that at all. Like, I used a predictive AI tool, Google reverse image search, when I was working on my book. I really wanted to understand how expensive OpenAI's furniture was, because I was trying to explain the upgrade that they received in their office from being a nonprofit to then being a Microsoft-backed commercial enterprise. And I took a screenshot of the chairs from their old office, a screenshot of the chairs from their new office, ran it through reverse image search, and it turns out the old office, it was like $2,000. It was still quite a lot, but then the new ones were like $20,000. And so I used that as a detail to paint this narrative. And so, absolutely, I think that there are tools that you can use responsibly. And the thing that I hope that people take away is ultimately to be aware of the full supply chain of each of these tools. Also, it's not all generative AI tools, right? There's different vendors for generative AI tools, and they all have different positionalities. There's the closed source companies, there's the open source companies, and each of these tools come from a set of values that essentially, like, I want consumers to be aware of those values and actually reflect when and how they use and which of these they use based on whether or not they agree with those values, whether they want to perpetuate the specific companies that are developing certain types of tools. And ultimately, I hope that we can see within the AI world something similar to what happened with the fashion industry or other types of supply chains, where there used to be in the fashion industry also extraordinary environmental and labor harms. And the answer was not, let's all stop wearing clothes. The answer was, let's shore up the supply chain so that we have clothes without harming lots of people. And that's a future that is totally possible for AI. We can absolutely build more AI tools that do not have all of these externalities. And if there is enough of a shift in consumer behavior, it will create new markets for the creation of those tools.
And another question from the audience is, if AI were to be more decentralized and equitably shared, would you be excited for a democracy of AI, or do you see the flaws as more fundamental? I have a little addendum of my own. I have been seeing various venture capitalists say, the internet democratized information, and AI will likewise be democratized. And yeah, I would like you to try to unpack that.
So I don't know whoever asked that question. I'm not sure I fully understand your phrase democracy of AI, but maybe I'll just say what I imagine to be democratic AI or democratized AI. So what the companies mean and what VCs mean is, we're going to decide everything and then unleash it onto the world, and that's democracy. And what I think we need is going back to the concept of a supply chain. There are lots of ingredients that go into creating these tools: the data, the supercomputers, as I mentioned, the labor, the talent. And then there are a lot of spaces in which these tools are then deployed. And all of these ingredients and all of these spaces are, to me, sites of democratic contestation. There should be people collectively talking about what data actually goes into training these models. I write about in the book one of the decisions that there were many decisions that OpenAI made around the data, but one of them was, should we keep pornographic images in the training data set for DALL-E? And then they had a conversation about it internally, and they were like, yeah, why not? Because it reflects the human experience. And ultimately, that specific decision then led to a lot of downstream consequences, which is that you can then have synthetically generated child sexual abuse material. Even if you don't have CSAM going in, if you have kids' photos and pornographic photos going in, you can then have pornographic kids' photos coming out. And that isn't something that should have just been decided by a small group of people having a discussion based on their own sets of values. That should have been something that was a public discussion. People should also be able to decide whether they can opt in or opt out of their own data. And we are starting to see, artists, writers, creators sue these companies saying, wait a minute, we never had an opportunity to say, yes, you can train on our data. And I think that is a really great way that they're reasserting their ownership over that resource. With the Chilean water activists, they're reasserting their ownership over that land, that water. And I think we need to see more of that. There's also huge discussions now in schools with students and teachers talking about how do we introduce AI into this space? Like, are there ways that we can do it to foster learning? Are there certain terms that we should agree upon for when we don't use these tools? Or are there certain vendors that we don't partner with? All of that needs to happen and is happening. But I think it needs to happen 1,000 times fold. And that is when I think we will get to democratic AI.
In the book, you talk about that decision, the fact that OpenAI was able to generate, well, I guess it was the text, right? Like GPT-2. But that was its first real interaction with the public, right? With child sexual abuse material. Can you tell folks a little bit about that story and how vital it was, the divorce that it led to?
I'm not sure.
I thought it was that they unleashed GPT-2 without any safety measures. People on AI Dungeon were creating CSAM.
Yeah. Okay.
That to me is it's kind of the origin story.
Yeah. So it was GPT-3. So when OpenAI started thinking about commercializing, the first thing they did was develop a B2B product instead of B2C. So GPT-3, they put into an API and started delivering to trusted customers, which was effectively a spreadsheet where all of the employees wrote down their family and friends and who would get access. And Greg Brockman gave access to a startup that his brother worked at, called Latitude. And Latitude then used GPT-3 to develop this game called AI Dungeons or AI Dungeons and Dragons. But it was effectively a choose your own adventure game, but where you can type out the scenarios and things. And Tom Simonite sitting there did a really great story on this that I cite in the book about what happened, which is that people then started imagining child sexual abuse scenarios, and there were no guardrails on GPT-3, so it just fully did that. It was just allowing these people to imagine these really graphic scenarios involving the abuse of children, and eventually OpenAI realizes, because they had just created a monitoring tool where they were seeing all of the interactions, and then this security person comes into a meeting one day and goes, guys, I have really bad news. People are talking a lot about sex, and everyone starts laughing, being like, haha, that's the internet, whatever. And then the person was like, no, they're talking about sex with children. And then it caused a whole crisis where they were like, oh crap, we need to deal with this. And what they decided was to blame Latitude. And so they penalized Latitude and made Latitude figure out how to deal with putting on content moderation filters onto the technology. But then they put out this release that shifted the blame to Latitude was irresponsible here. They didn't responsibly deploy this technology. But there were employees that were telling me during that time that they felt awful, because they were like, that was ultimately our responsibility. We knew, we could have predicted that would have happened, because in the previous version of AI Dungeons, before it had been upgraded with GPT-3, there had already been instances of people abusing it in that way. And so the employees were saying, if we had just thought about it for 5 seconds, we would have concluded that this would have been an issue, and then we would have implemented our own controls before just giving it over.
We have time for one last question. It's a really good one. As someone who works in this field, the doomer versus boomer discourse dichotomy can feel so exhausting. Have you seen any effective middle grounds, people whose work are based in real action evidence beyond theory and belief? Thank you.
So I call the middle ground the AI accountability space, which is the space that I occupy, which is the space that Timnit Gebru occupies. And it is the space that recognizes what we're seeing here, which is that there is an extraordinary concentration of power that these companies are able to amass and accrue. And we need to hold these entities accountable. And we hold them accountable in part by documenting in real time what they are doing, both internally and the effects that happen out in the world. And that was very much the spirit of my book, was just documenting what is literally happening right now as the antidote to the theoretical boomer doomer rhetoric and its kind of its ungrounded, lofty, head in the clouds nature.
Yeah. If there is, you had to freeze the book at some point, right? Is there anything that's happening now that you would have included in your book as, to support this empire thesis?
I froze the book, I want to say like 5 days before Stargate was announced. And yeah, so the Stargate project, for people who don't know, is a $500 billion investment, or it is a plan to invest $500 billion of private capital into the construction of more AI computing infrastructure that President Trump announced at the podium on a second day in office, standing next to Sam Altman. And OpenAI has said that $500 billion investment is all to build its own supercomputing, its next supercomputing cluster, which is now underway in Abilene, Texas. And there are two things that if I had the opportunity to write about that I would have highlighted. One is the amount of money that we're talking about. I mean, I really do think that it is a tactic to throw out these figures that the average person has never encountered, because then it becomes unfathomable. But just to compare 500 billion, like the plan is 500 billion over 4 years. The Apollo program, which sent the first man to the moon, was $300 billion in today's dollars over 13 years. And that comparison still feels a little bit squishy. Like, you still can't really conceptualize 500 billion. So that's one, is that we are continuing to escalate the amount of capital, the amount of resource concentration that these companies have. But the second is that we are now seeing a historic alliance between Silicon Valley in its empire era with the U.S. government in its empire era. The U.S. government is also engaging in very clear empire rhetoric where, Trump is talking about taking over Greenland, taking over land from Canada, and like fortifying the America's dominance in the world. Essentially an analogy that I also didn't put into the book is this historical analogy to the British East India Company, which there's this really amazing book called The Anarchy by historian William Dalrymple that talks about the history of the British colonization of India and how it was actually originally a company that colonized India, not the British Empire. The British East India Company originally engaged in mutually beneficial economic trade with India, and then as it gained more and more economic leverage, it then gained more and more political leverage, and then it reached a point where it became the apex predator. It was more powerful than any other entity in India, and therefore could just do whatever it wanted. And OpenAI and many companies in Silicon Valley, I think, have now, with the full backing of the Trump administration, reached that status where previously you could have argued that even if they were more powerful than pretty much any other government in the world, that at least they weren't as powerful as the U.S. government. But the U.S. government is now just creating, literally this week, Republicans put in something into their tax bill that would create a ban on AI regulation at the state level for the next 10 years. And it was just passed through the House. It is now going up to the Senate. And if the Senate passes that, what other indication that these companies have reached apex predator status than a complete legislative action that opens up the ground for them to do whatever they want. And the reason why we're seeing this alliance is because the U.S. government views Silicon Valley as their own empire building asset. Silicon Valley also views the US government as their own empire building asset. And ultimately, this is a very tenuous relationship that I think could explode at any moment, because who is walking the dog is unclear. Like they both have ambitions to subsume the other. But ultimately, the conclusion, no matter who subsumes whom, like, it's bad. Like the both versions of the story are bad. And so, just to end on a more optimistic note, like, I really do think that we need to remember that all of the, like, that we still actually do live in a democracy, even when there's a crisis of leadership at the top. The beautiful thing about democracy is that we can have leadership at the bottom, and we need to show that leadership more than ever. And that is the role that we all need to step into. And I really hope that the book is a platform for people to take that mantle.
Thank you for listening. You can watch discussions like this every weekend on C-SPAN 2's Book TV. Go to our website, cspan.org/booktv for more information. Next week on the Afterwards podcast, Eric Trump talks about his book, Under Siege: My Family's Fight to Save Our Nation.